Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Monday of this year. Professor Barbieri and I began this program last year, and we're thrilled that we've been renewed for our second season. And this is the inaugural meeting of our second season, and it's so appropriate that it be held on the first Monday of October. As most of you know, the first Monday of October is the official opening of the term of the United States Supreme Court. And this term, for the first time in 17 years, the beloved Ruth Bader Ginsburg will not be present for the opening of the court. If we were sitting there, we would be looking at a bench, which would have her seat immediately to the right of the Chief Justice, shrouded in black. And both Professor Barbieri and I want very much to dedicate this particular first Monday to her service, to her legacy, and to her memory. So first Mondays were started because we thought about how easy it is for students in particular, but for all of us as lawyers, to sort of get lost in the detail of the law and to focus in on the law apart from the broader societal, cultural, and political issues. And more importantly, because of our constant influx of news, to be hit with the political, cultural, moral, social issues of our time, separated from the legal overlay. So the idea of First Mondays was to give a legal overlay to the current issues of the day. And of course, our subject for today is probably the most important current issues of the day. Our idea is to shed as much light and as little heat. These sessions are to be respectful of the speaker, of the participants, of each other, to bring to the discussion the concern for the views of others that the discussion merits. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Barbieri, who will introduce today's guest.
Thanks, Professor Rehan, and thanks for everyone joining now. Looks like we have around 25 participants, which is excellent. I have the distinct honor today of welcoming our guests. We are very fortunate to have a national voting rights expert join us today. Professor Gilda Daniels is an associate professor at University of Baltimore School of Law, where she teaches civil procedure, election law, appellate advocacy, critical legal theory. She has extensive government experience too, which is relevant to the conversation. Most recently in the Department of Justice under two presidents, both Republican and Democrat, in the Civil Rights Division voting section. In addition to those activities, she's the Director of Litigation at the Advancement Project, which students interested in public interest work need to check out, especially if you're interested in voting rights. She's the author of UNCOUNTED, a Crisis of Voter Suppression in America, which is out by NYU Press, which we're delighted to have her talk about today. Not least of all, she's a graduate of Grambling State University, a historically Black university in Louisiana. But she came to law school in New York State, our great state, a couple hours south of us in New York City at NYU School of Law, where she was a Root Tilden Scholar, focusing on public interest, which is excellent. So, Professor Daniels, we're so thrilled to have you here today. We'd love for you to talk a little bit about, really anything you want to talk about related to the book, but we're really excited about the topics and themes covered in the book. And just, I'll mention briefly to students, if you haven't read the book yet, it's available in hard copy, digital, and audiobook. NYU Press is offering 30% discount. The details were in the registration. We also have a copy in our library now, so if you want to access it that way too, you should. But Professor Daniels, tell us a little bit about the ideas in the book and why you wrote it.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Barbieri and Professor Rehan. I'm really honored to be here today, speaking to you, not only about the book, but certainly these very important issues that we're facing as a country. And how we faced them previously, right, in our history, and how we can certainly use history to help us to forge a better path, and hopefully a more egalitarian path and a more democratic democratic way. I know they've only given me a few minutes to talk. I have a PowerPoint, so I can start sharing that screen. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am.
That's
Okay,
great. And just as you're loading your slides, I'll just mention, participants, feel free to raise a hand or put something in the chat if you have a question for Professor Daniels, and we'll moderate that. But yeah, she'll go through her slides, and then we'll do some Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you again. Again, I'm honored to be here today, and am, as he's mentioned, I've essentially spent more than 2 decades working on the issue of voting rights. And part of that time certainly worked in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Voting Section as a staff attorney, and then as a deputy chief in the voting section, and continue to work on voting rights issues and other issues, but particularly voting rights issues. And I write about voting rights and the intersection of race, law, and democracy. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I felt like there's a need to connect the dots. You would see books or articles on one aspect of voter suppression. They may talk about voter ID or felon disenfranchisement, but there wasn't a place where people were connecting how all these voter suppression measures connected to show us what voter suppression looks like in America. For example, you may see articles that talk about Texas and voter ID and how it impacted more than 600,000 Black and brown people. But also in Florida, there's the felon disenfranchisement laws in Florida impact more than 1.4 million people. So if you're only talking about voter ID in Texas, or only talking about felon disenfranchisement in Florida, you're missing that you're essentially talking about 2 million people. And that's just 2 examples of how voter suppression and voter suppression tactics and how we use law to suppress. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And the book is a general audience book. I know, you all are various levels of your matriculation, and that you're in first year, second years, or third years, but the book is a general audience book where I use firsthand accounts of people and their experience with voting. But I think it's important that, what the book hopes to do is provide a framework so that we can talk about voter suppression in ways that we can address it. And in order to have that conversation, I think we have to talk about history, right? And how we, in this country, we essentially have what I call this paradoxical democracy. And at the same time that we said all men are created equal, the founding fathers also developed this 3/5 compromise. And the 3/5 compromise essentially said that enslaved persons would only be counted as 3 of 5 persons, as opposed to how whites would be counted as whole persons, right? And they would do that for the purposes of apportionment. So from the beginning of the founding of our country, we decided that we would use certainly the vote and the power of the vote as a sort of caste system, and develop this second-class citizenship in regards to who can have the full range of benefits of citizenship. So, so all men are created equal, and yet only at that time, white men who owned property had the ability to cast a ballot. It wasn't until the passage of the Civil War amendments, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th Amendment provided equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment said that you could not discriminate based on race in voting, right? So it was the 15th Amendment that actually expanded the democratic process. In the 15th Amendment, Black men were given the right to vote, and they exercised that right to its full extent for a very short period of time. And they elected persons on the state, local, and federal levels. You see that in the certainly during the time of Reconstruction, that the state of Mississippi elected 2 African Americans to the United States Senate. We have not had 2 African Americans from the South since the 1880s. We only have 3 African Americans in the United States Senate today. So from the 1880s to 2020, we've had an increase of 1 because there are 3 African Americans in the United States Senate, as opposed to the fact that there were 2 certainly elected, although they didn't sit at the same time, 2 elected from the same state in the South. This was short-lived. This type of advancement, and certainly the utilizing the right to vote, was short-lived, in large part because the states, the former Confederate states, in order to return to the Union, had to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And they took that opportunity as the opportunity to have these constitutional conventions where they would adopt the Civil War amendments, but they also adopted mechanisms that would eliminate the Black vote. The senators who are segregationists and certainly white supremacists used this as a way to redeem what they call this period of redemption, where they were essentially redeeming the country. And they felt that a large part of that would be to eliminate Blacks from the ballot box, and they were very effective. In 1896 in Alabama, there were more than 140,000 Black men who were registered to vote. In 1906 in Alabama, there were 46 Black men who were registered to vote. Because of, while they had these constitutional conventions, they passed poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and even felon disenfranchisement, where they assigned certain crimes as disenfranchising and decided that they would assign those crimes that they believed Black men that Black men committed more often than white men. And so they were able to effectively eliminate the Black vote in a very short period of time. So the ability to actually operate under the 15th Amendment lasted less than 20 years, from the passage of the 15th Amendment to the adoption of these constitutions, these new state constitutions that implemented these disenfranchising devices, such as the poll tax and literacy tests. So in the early 1920s, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the right to vote for women. And there were more than 8 million women were able to vote in the 1920 presidential election after the passage of the amendment. And so I just think it's important to know the history. This is a picture of Mary Church Terrell, who was an African-American and activist in regards to suffrage, women's suffrage. But even though we had the 15th and the 19th Amendment, there's still, people of color were still not able to register and vote. You see, even in the 1950s, in 1957, Dr. King talks about these conniving methods that were still being used. And they were being used against people like my grandmother, who I use as a framework in the book. My grandmother lived to be 99 years old. She passed away last year. And so what I've seen in looking at how we vote and who gets to vote and voter suppression is to essentially have these 100-year cycles. And although my grandmother was born in 1919, and you had the 15th Amendment, and then you had the 19th Amendment, and she was born in 1919, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, she didn't vote, or she voted for the first time in the 1960s, which was after the passage of the Voter Rights Act. She was a Black woman who lived in the South. And so although you had constitutional amendments that said you cannot discriminate based on these factors, those literacy tests, poll taxes, economic terror, fear, right? There are a number of massacres that are directly related to Black people, Black and brown people exercising, trying to exercise their right to vote. And it's important to know that things such as literacy tests, while they certainly existed in the South, and there's an example in my book of Miss Myrtle Pless Jones, who is the mother of one of my colleagues at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and her experience in being having to undergo a literacy test in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s. Ms. Myrtle Pless Jones was a graduate of South Carolina State University and had a master's degree from Michigan State University. Yet when she went to register to vote, she had to answer, in the 1950s, she was asked, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? She said around 100 and was told that her answer was wrong. And she was not allowed to register to vote. So it's those kinds of conniving methods, a literacy test. And there's also a story I have of Ms. Jimenez, who was in New York State and migrated from Puerto Rico to New York. And in order for her to cast a ballot, she had to take a literacy test in New York State. So although certainly it was prevalent in the South and Southwest, and the experience of these conniving methods was true for people of color throughout the South and Southwest. And even you see an example of even in the North, these kinds of methods were prevalent and very effective. As I stated, my grandmother didn't vote until the Voting Rights Act, passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And it's been called, Ronald Reagan called the Voting Rights Act the crown jewel. Lyndon Baines Johnson said that it was monumental. But this chart shows you why it was necessary. Well, there are many reasons why it was necessary, but certainly you look at particularly a state like Mississippi, where less than 10% of African Americans who are eligible to register were actually registered, as compared to 70% of whites. And these numbers reflect the existence of poll taxes, literacy tests, and other devices that were put in place to ensure. They were put in place certainly during those constitutional conventions in the early 1900s that continue to have an effect in 1965. And the Voting Rights Act has certainly helped to eliminate in some places those gaps that existed in regards to voter registration. But we know, certainly those are certain examples of voter suppression. Historically, we may have called it a poll tax, but there are contemporary ways in which voting is suppressed. And so certainly some of these are just an example of some of the ways that are utilized today. Right? And proof of citizenship laws, voter intimidation, voter deception, et cetera. So we certainly have, again, these cycles where it might have been called one thing decades ago, but today it certainly has the same impact. One of those examples of something that's still called the same thing is certainly felon disenfranchisement. And if you've probably been, you are aware that particular place that you can see how felon disenfranchisement works is and has been and continues to be the state of Florida, where more than 1 million people do not have the right to vote because of previous conviction of a felony. The state of Florida, the citizens of Florida actually passed an amendment, what's called Amendment 4, that would have restored the right to vote to those more than 1 million people. Yet the legislature decided that before they could register to vote, they had to pay their fines, fees, and restitution. That was in the ballot initiative passed in 2018. The legislature indicated that additional measures had to be in place in 2019, and this matter is still being litigated. So those people who thought that they had regained the right to vote in 2018, today is the date for the last date for registration in the state of Florida for the November election, and we still don't have an answer from the court. There's a question of whether or not this case will be appealed to the United States Supreme Court. But you're talking about 1 million people who thought they had regained the right to vote, but don't have that because of the way law has intersected, certainly with race and democracy. Another issue that we are seeing today is vote by mail. There's a lot of noise about vote by mail and whether or not you should use it and how, and certainly the misinformation around vote by mail is certainly serving as a way of certainly suppressing the votes, and the relationship of the Postal Service and how the Postal Service is being utilized, as well as another issues in regards to voter suppression is the militarization of the right to vote, right? How this right to vote is being weaponized, certainly with threats of having poll watchers and seeing certainly folk in military gear outside of polling places is voter intimidation. And these things are not new. These are ways of suppressing the votes and certainly intimidating voters that have existed and continue to exist. How do we find solutions, right? First of all, certainly voting is the solution. And I say to young people, how do you, if you care about issues such as criminal justice reform or racial equality, or gender equality or climate change, it's important that you vote, and that we can continue to try to knock down these barriers to the right to vote. In the book, I talk about various things like having a right to vote amendment is a possibility, as well as continuing to adopt things such as same-day voter registration, expanding early voting, having maybe instituting compulsory voting. But in regards to what the kinds of things that you can do as individuals, I tell people to do 4 things. Excuse me, I tell people to do 4 things: educate, legislate, litigate, participate. Educate yourselves about the voting process, voter registration deadlines, how can you vote, where can you vote, when can you vote, and tell other people. Right? Make sure that registration deadlines are coming up soon, and except in places that have same-day voter registration. So make sure that you're registered. Also, legislate. Be aware of legislation that impacts the right to vote, such as federal laws. There's HR 1 that's been on Mitch McConnell's desk for more than 200 days. There's HR 4 that's been on his desk for about 140 days. That would impact the ability of states to actually execute the right to vote. A lot of these bills provide money for states and locales to buy new machines and other measures. Finally, litigate, partner with organizations, working with election protection on election day. If lobbying, I might get folk into trouble, but lobby your dean to make election day a day where students have the ability to actually go out and register or work on election day. Participate. One of the things I tell people to do is sign up to be poll workers. Which, so if you can't, this could be an excused absence of sorts for students who want to serve as poll workers, because in the midst of COVID-19, there is a need for poll workers. Certainly across the country, right? And also to register others to vote. I want to stress that when we're talking about voter suppression and talking about the act of voting, I don't care who you vote for, because I think we've set up these binaries, right? Where it's Republican versus Democrat, and we are so politicized, but voting is not, it should not be a black-white issue or a Republican-Democrat issue. It is a fundamental democratic issue, and I think we need to treat it as such, and we need to stop dancing around the edges, is what I call it, in saying this is how we are going to treat the right to vote, and we need some uniform standards on how people can access the right to vote, and the kinds of measures that are in place that freely that gives everyone the opportunity to participate freely, fairly, and in a non-discriminatory fashion. I say throughout the book that we have to fight to vote for the right to vote. And so I'm certainly asking you all to continue in this fight and to join this fight, and to do so by educating, legislating, litigating, and participating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'd like to take co-host privilege and ask a first question, if I may.
Absolutely.
I think it's fascinating to look at the formal, if you will, hard obstacles to voting, and those obstacles being particularly directed to persons of color, originally to women as well, but certainly throughout the history to persons of color. What I've found so interesting this time is what we might call soft obstacles. So I believe it's Texas, the governor noted that there'd be one drop box per county. So if you have a means of transportation, you're able perhaps to locate that drop box and drop your ballot. If you don't have a means of transportation, that's meaningless to you. It's not written into the law, but it's certainly there to make it much more difficult for certain groups of people to vote. We know from some of the primaries, we know from the 2018 elections that strangely, polling places in Black and brown neighborhoods had fewer working machines, had fewer poll workers, and not surprisingly then, consequentially had extremely long lines. And extremely long lines in situations where people, since it's not a national holiday, people couldn't stand in line for 8 hours to vote. Even if they have the physical stamina to do it, they had to get to work. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about those soft obstacles, and especially now that the U.S. Supreme Court has decided that those certain states that the federal government would not review their voting practices. I wonder if you could just speak to those soft obstacles and how you see them being effective or ineffective and what we do about them.
Right, it's interesting that you characterize them as soft, because again, these are not new tactics. These are, so for example, in the 1950s and 1960s, you'd have jurisdictions that would only have the registrar of voters open for like 1 hour a week, so that they could essentially to prevent folk from utilizing those services. It's important that all these things appear neutral, right? And you assume that they apply fairly to others. In the Crawford versus Marion case, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said essentially that she thought that there was a group of persons where we could find that there was certainly that the voter ID law in Indiana was inappropriate and impacted them such that it created a violation of the Constitution. And she said it's for poor people, right? And that should be enough, essentially. And she said, if we really want people to vote, why do we make it so hard for them to do so? And essentially, that's what these soft laws, as you call them, do. For those of you who don't or who are not aware, Thursday or Friday of last week, the governor of Texas said that he would only allow the counties to have one drop box. Think about a city like Houston, Texas, or Dallas, Texas. One drop box. And you mentioned I mentioned vote by mail, and certainly concerns that people have about the U.S. Postal Service. One of the ways that people could address their concerns about the Postal Service and their ballot was to utilize drop boxes in their cities and locales. But the governor of Texas says you can only have one per county, which is completely absurd, and is currently in litigation. To think that the governor is making a decision about what the county level registrars and supervisors of elections are able to do, they are making those decisions on a county level. A place like Houston, Texas, which is Harris County, may need 20 drop boxes at various locations. So to say that you can only use one, while though it appears neutral, right? There's only one, but it's only one for everybody. we can demonstrate that those kinds of exclusions and contractions disproportionately impact not only persons of lower socioeconomic means, but also certainly Black and brown people, because we've seen polling place closures in primarily Black and brown neighborhoods. And we've seen places that have, I'm a big NBA fan, and there's a push to have the NBA stadiums, thank you, as voting centers. And so what essentially happens, like what happened in, I believe, Louisville and parts of Kentucky, where it moved from, I think, 650 polling places to one, which was the convention center. Okay, you say, oh, it's one, it's in middle downtown. Yeah, but if you consider that previously you had to walk across the street or walk 2 blocks to the school or the church to cast your ballot, now, particularly in this era of COVID, you have to not only bring yourself, but figure out who's going to watch your child because they're at home from school, and how and can you get off work, because since you're working from home, all of those issues certainly come into play. And while again it seems neutral, the way these laws are being applied certainly have a disproportionate impact. You mentioned one other thing, Professor Rayhan, and that was the Supreme Court decision that made it possible for Texas to do these kinds of acts. In 2013, the United States Supreme Court rendered the decision in Shelby County versus Holder, where it said that parts of the Voting Rights Act was outdated and unconstitutional. One of the primary portions of the Voting Rights Act was Section 5, which required certain jurisdictions to submit their voting changes to either the Attorney General for the United States or the DC District Court for approval before they could implement them. So that would have prevented Governor Abbott from saying on Thursday, you can only have one drop box and that being implemented on Friday. Because if they had to continue, if they had to adhere to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, they would have had to submit that to the Justice Department so that there could be a determination as to whether or not it had a regressive impact on voters of color before it could be implemented. And I could assure you that this kind of change, and particularly less than 30 days before the election, is something that would have been objected to and would have not have been able to be in place. But without Section 5, and certainly since Shelby County, states like Texas and governors like Texas have taken it upon themselves to adopt these certainly regressive and suppressive measures.
I'll jump in, and we have a couple student questions, which I'll get to in a moment, but just want to mention with respect to Shelby County, so that's a Roberts Court decision, and my sense from the book is that you're really skeptical of Justice Roberts' reliance on the sort of being post, everything is okay now, there isn't voter suppression. It seems like that was certainly a running theme through the book, just something to highlight, especially for students who are listening today. So the Shelby County case, Roberts Court case, very critical in terms of allowing this type of behavior to continue at law.
Absolutely, and the court, Justice Roberts is the same person who wrote the memo during when he was working for President Reagan, which essentially says that the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. So yeah, sure. I think anytime the Supreme Court is looking at a Voting Rights Act case, certainly in this Roberts Court, I'm a bit skeptical, and even more so now that we no longer have Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah. Great. So let's turn our attention back to Florida. Daniel Schmidt asks, specifically with respect to felon disenfranchisement in Florida, there's been some news stories recently, a 60 Minutes piece a couple weeks ago about the money that individuals who are returning from incarceration still owe, and whether that barrier is still in place. Mike Bloomberg and others have been raising money to assist in paying the court costs and restitution that individuals who have been criminal justice system involved have to pay. So you mentioned today is the last day for voter registration in Florida. What's the state of, can formerly incarcerated individuals, can individuals with a felony record vote in Florida?
Well, so to use a technical term, Florida is a hot mess. It is in regards to, and I think the case is Jones versus DeSantis, and it's actually a consolidation of about 5 different cases. But Jones versus DeSantis argues that the legislative statute that requires persons who have gotten their right to vote restored with the ballot initiative. Maybe I need to back up to Amendment 4. So Amendment 4 essentially said, so first of all, it was a grassroots effort. There were people on the ground that said, we've tried litigation to remove this felon disenfranchisement law in Florida, which was essentially permanently disenfranchising people. So it said, we tried litigation, we tried policy, and we haven't won. So FRC, it was led by Desmond Meade, said, let's try a ballot initiative. So they got the signatures to get the ballot initiative on the ballot, and it was essentially would allow persons who persons who have a disenfranchising felony to once they've completed their probation and parole to get their right to vote restored, to be able to register to vote. Now we thought certainly at the Advancement Project, certainly we thought the amendment was self-executing, that if the people voted for this amendment, then that meant that these more than 1 million people could actually register to vote. The legislation thought differently and said, no, it's not self-executing. There's still some things need to be done. Now, more than 60% of Floridians, 64% of Floridians said, yes, they should have their right to vote restored, right? So we think everybody believes that, but this legislature said, there's a subtitle in one of my books, which is in this book, which says free at last, not so fast. So essentially free at last, not so fast, that you have to pay these fines, fees, and restitution. And the ACLU and other groups argued that that was essentially saying that there was a poll tax, that it was that the ability to register was based on a person's ability to pay. And the lower court agreed. The 11th Circuit recently said that the lower court got it wrong. And now it's a question of whether or not the ACLU, Brennan Center, Campaign Legal Center, and others are going to appeal to the United States Supreme Court. So the status today is that those persons can register if they've completed paying their fines, fees, and restitution, or if they've regained their rights through the Florida Clemency Board. I mentioned Desmond Meade, who was certainly one of the leaders on this effort. He recently went before the Clemency Board a week ago and was denied by the governor the ability to have his right to vote restored. Whereas another person who was working closely with him on this effort gained his right to vote. So it's really arbitrary and capricious in how it happens. But if you can pay your fees, fines, and restitution, then you can have your right to vote restored. But one of the issues is that many of the counties, the supervisors of elections, don't know how to calculate, where to find how much money. They can't even tell people how much money they owe. So they can't tell people how much money they owe so that they can pay the money. And for a lot of people, we're talking about like $1,000 or less, but that's a lot of money in these times at any time. And certainly to have to condition that payment, condition your ability to register on that payment, certainly looks like something that is certainly serving as an impediment to the right to vote. The 11th Circuit disagreed, but then there's the question of, do you take this up to the United States Supreme Court? With
all of the impediments, the sort of the ground level, impossibility or impracticability, it might lead one to feel apathetic about the system and question whether the system is actually, whether we can affect change within the system with respect to voter suppression. We have two questions related to sort of apathy. Liz Helmer asks, what would you say to people who have lost faith in the system and its ability to bring about change? Words of sunny outlook.
Absolutely. So here's the sunny outlook. So the slide where I talked about, if you're concerned about these issues, if you're concerned about climate change, if you were in them streets, right? If you were in those streets over the summer protesting the heinous crimes of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and you may still be in the streets over Breonna Taylor. Right. And so if you care about those issues, if you care about climate change in places like Georgia in November, you can elect who the sheriff is, right? If you're upset that the sheriff didn't arrest the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery until months later, you can use your vote to determine who the sheriff is and who the DA is. You don't like that the Attorney General of Kentucky, the way he utilized or the grand jury process, you can elect the Attorney General. So I think it's important that we look at all of the races in regards to all of the candidates. If you're upset that they are replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg before she's even in the grave, right? Guess what? You can elect your senators in a number of these states, right? So you can certainly talk about from going from protest to power. Yes, protesting is a tool. Your vote is a tool. John Lewis, who recently passed away, in his letter that he put in the New York Times, essentially said to young people, don't be disheartened, that it's a long road, and that you got to keep walking. You got to keep walking. You got to keep making these steps. And voting is certainly a very important step that we cannot afford to ignore and can't afford to not utilize it to its fullest.
I like that metaphor. Keep walking. You also talk about not sleeping at a dangerous time, or I guess you're sleeping at a dangerous time as a cautionary message to stay awake, stay vigilant. Certainly students listening now, think about opportunities you have to engage. The educate, legislate, litigate, participate. I think that those are important takeaways. Well, and you talked about remedies with respect to both the right to vote amendment in the book, and we have a question about compulsory voting and voter apathy. Many of those who may have the right to vote or can vote but choose not to, sort of relating back to the last question. But what are your thoughts on the impact of compulsory voting on American democracy? Possible remedy for voter apathy? What do you think?
Well, I talk about it in a few places in the book. One place is where I talk about voter purges and the Husted versus APRI, A. Philip Randolph Institute case, and how you couldn't be purged for not voting in 2 federal elections, and so that if folk are knowledgeable about, certainly not that if they can lose their right to vote for not voting, maybe it can serve as a way of instituting compulsory voting, right? That people are more compelled to vote so that they don't have to re-register, so they don't lose their right to vote. And I think, and so when we look at other countries that use compulsory voting, there is a question of whether or not that's some people would consider it anti-democratic, because essentially in the United States you have the right not to vote. That if you choose not to exercise your right to vote, that is your choice. But knowing that in some states, there are only a few states, but certainly states like Ohio and Georgia, you could lose your right to vote, at least be removed from the voter rolls. So I mean, I think it's questionable whether I think it would be I think certainly it would be more of a federal law that would be instituted. I think there'd be a whole lot. I think by the time by the time that they finish litigating that issue, it would be a moot question. But you know, it is something that other countries are using. I think if we want people to participate more, maybe we have to compel them to do so. And you can also give them a tax break of sorts, right? Make them, if you vote, then you get the right. There's this whole how do you determine whether or not that happens. So it's all in a way of how do we, because I don't think there's one answer in the how we can increase voter participation. Like vote by mail is something that everybody's talking about, but you need vote by mail, you need expanded early voting, you need to make sure that people are safe on election day, and you know, you need a national holiday. States like Virginia, it's a state holiday on election day. So you got to have all those things to make sure that people have as many opportunities as possible to access their right to vote.
We probably have time for at least one more question. If someone wants to raise a hand or put something in the chat, while we wait for that, you know, you talked in the chapter on voter deception and sort of this, you know, disseminating. If you want to vote yes, if you're voting yes, vote on Tuesday. If you're voting no, vote on Wednesday. And you have an interesting comment there. You talk about the you know, First Amendment right to speak as a right to speak freely, but not to speak falsely, which I thought was a really interesting sort of assertion. And I don't know if it was central to your argument, but you know, it just this important notion of we feel like we have the right to speak, all this sort of you know, political speech that often seems deceptive, but it's not necessarily an unbridled right or unlimited right. So I wonder if, you know, it's sort of in the context of voting, specifically with voter deception, if you have some thoughts about how that's manifesting these days.
Oh, I have lots of thoughts about that. I actually wrote a law review article, and the title of it is Voter Deception, as well as the chapter in the book. And so, you know, we have this, we're in a quagmire, right, where political speech is the highest level of speech, right? Yet we have all this, you know, and people use, instead of voter deception, people call it misinformation and disinformation. That is lies, right? And certainly when some of the examples in the book where you have elected officials who are giving out the wrong information, right? And then, you know, and I think, you know, you also have, you know, information like with students. One of the examples was, you know, just post #Hillary, and then you essentially cast your ballot. I can understand how a college student or a student would think that, okay, if I just do #Hillary and then #Department of Elections, then I've cast the ballot. But we're not there yet. We can't, you know, you have to actually show up in person or use an actual ballot. So so we can, you know, looking at certainly how we treat speech, and how we treat deceptive speech, and how we treat deceptive political speech is something that needs to be something that needs to be addressed. Make some suggestions, but certainly, yeah, and it also have this issue with politics, right? People expect politicians to lie. But when it impacts the ability of people to access the right to vote, I say that's when the line has been crossed, and that's when there has to be some consequences for those statements.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sort of heartened when you know, Instagram has buttons on, you know, how to request a ballot, how to, you know, are you registered to vote, how do you request a ballot. You know, if you're a military person, you know, how do you do military and overseas voting? Will that combat some of what you're talking about? I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah. And I think it's also important that people know where they're getting their information from, that we have trusted sources of information. For example, in Virginia started their early voting process maybe a couple of weeks ago, but I learned from someone I was actually on another Zoom call with, that her parents had received a ballot that looked official but was not, and it had already and so, you know, so the kind of information that people get in the mail in regards can be deceptive, and so it's important. And it was a ballot that they said that they could return, and it would be counted when it actually was not. So, you know, so it's really important that people know the sources of their information. on Instagram, because Facebook certainly was an issue, was a big issue in 2016 in regards to just having a host of misinformation. That's why I tell people to go to your Secretary of State's office, go to your Department of Elections, Division of Elections in your county, to make sure you're getting the most accurate information, as well as organizations that you can trust, right? Organizations like Advancement Project, NAACP, LDF, DMOS, Brennan Center for Justice. So, you know, but certainly the Secretary of State's office, Division of Elections, or Department of Elections for your county, it's places where you can find out what are the dates, how can you register, how can you vote, when can you vote, who can vote, what do you need to take with you in order to cast a ballot.
So don't sleep at a dangerous time. Educate. You certainly, we thank you for doing that today with us and joining us. Legislate and litigate, some steps students can investigate and involve themselves in, and then participate, right? So those four takeaways. I guess with that, you know, want to thank Professor Gilda Daniels for joining us for our first Mondays of the new academic year, election, you know, federal election year. What is it? I don't, less than 30 days away. So, you know, thanks so much for your time, and appreciate you joining.
Thank you.
And thank you to the Office of Institutional Advancement for doing all the technical work. When Ted and I started, we just gathered in a classroom, and I see many of our alums from that first meeting. Now it's much more sophisticated, but it allows us to meet you and to be educated by you, Professor Daniels. So thank you so very much. And thanks to all of you who attended.
Thank you.